Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, either live in person for the premiere episode or on demand at your convenience. We are glad you are here. And today we are going to talk about what's it worth, valuing a business for sale. On behalf of Financial Poise and our panel of speakers, Natasha Escobedo, Nate Ladwig, Susie Saxman, Andrew Schneider, and myself, John Levitsky. I'm the moderator. We welcome you. I'd like to walk through a few background administrative items before we begin, and then I'll introduce our panel. The goal today is to have a lively, dynamic conversation. It'll be a Q&A, and we also have some materials, which I'll leaf through to point out the contents of the materials. Our program is brought to you today through the Financial Poise platform. We have 3 sponsors we'd like to express our appreciation to. Mood, M-O-O-D. We also have Type to Learn, Sunburst Digital. And we also have Max Asset as our sponsors. Of course, today is just general information, so there's a disclaimer in the materials. This is not specific and it's not advice. If you're seeking advice, please reach out to the appropriate attorney or expert. Also, if you have questions regarding today's content, or if you'd like to reach out to any of us, our contact information is in the back of the deck. Our speakers, as I mentioned, are Natasha, Escobedo with Epstein Knock here in Chicago, Nate Ladwig with Cohen & Company here in Chicago, Suzanne, she goes by Susie Saxman with Seyfarth Shaw, based here in Chicago, and Andrew Schneider with Archetype Capital Partners, and me, John Levitsky, I'm with HKA Global. A little summary about what we're going to talk about basically is demystifying valuing a business for sale. We'll talk about things like standard of value and some technical terms like DCF and EBITDA. We'll talk about differences between price and value and some of the important questions that owners or advisors or consultants or investors may have on their minds. This is part of a series. We have several programs on valuation topics. This is the first of 5. And then, as I mentioned, as a resource, we have these slide materials that you're welcome to download. You're welcome to write on either electronically or otherwise. If you'd like to print them out and take some notes today, you're very welcome to do that. They provide background, additional information. I will just leaf through them quickly so you can see there are a few dozen slides here that you probably will find helpful. They touch on some of the topics we will discuss. And as I mentioned in the back, there are bios for each of us with our contact information. So please feel free to reach out to any of us. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Natasha, Nate, Susie, and Andrew. And we're going to talk about 10 or 15 topics that we think you as the audience will find helpful. So first, Nate, we're talking about demystifying valuation. Well, is there a time point when a business owner should thinking about getting a valuation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I kind of put this in the category of if you think you might need to do it, or if you're asking yourself the question, then you should probably be taking action on it. This is the rule I use with my dermatologist. But if you're a business owner, your business is a tremendous part of your overall financial health and well-being, obviously, and it is going to be integral to planning for, whether retirement or, estate planning. And so you really do want to have a handle on what that is, what the value is for all those purposes. And, I think business owners generally do have a pretty good sense of what their value is worth to them, or to maybe in the market they see transactions or competitors being bought up and stuff like that. I mean, in my experience, owners are very in tune with their own industry. the reason to have a team of advisors is sort of for those things that you don't know, you don't know. And because, other potential buyers might have perspectives that you're not necessarily aware of, and maybe thinking of certain things. And there's actions you can do to enhance the value of your business in the meantime. So it's critical to get that team of advisors set up early. And I didn't really answer the question, but I would measure it in years. I think you want to be years ahead of any potential sale or transition.
Are there compliance reasons where evaluation might be helpful as well?
Absolutely. I mean, if you are going to be gifting any of your interests to like the next generation of your family, if you have a family business, you're going to need to have valuations done for tax purposes, for the gift tax purposes there. So that's definitely a big one that you see on the compliance side. Yeah.
Well, Susie, we're talking about valuation, but sale of the business sounds like that could be a potential motivation for thinking about getting a valuation. Also, succession might be a part of the contemplation here. So are there some critical mistakes that business owners often make in terms of planning succession or the sale of a business?
Thanks, John. To me, the biggest mistake is there's too much procrastination. I think people don't want to think about it. I think it's tough, especially if it's a family-owned business. It's often very difficult, maybe emotional, to even think about the prospect that you might move your family-owned business into somebody else's hands. So a little bit of procrastination and sometimes just not really kind of appreciating how important it is to be prepared. What I normally recommend to business owners is if you think that down the road sometime it might be, an option or maybe even absolute necessity that you're going to have to sell the business at some point just to be able to get your investment out or the value of what you've built. Now's really the time. I say, oh, go talk to a couple of different investment bankers. Find somebody, I give people recommendations to investment bankers all the time. I always say talk to several. You learn a lot about your industry. You learn a lot about your business. What would be a good timetable? What are the things you need to do? What's a realistic expectation for value based upon the market? Not so much based upon a technical valuation, but what are they seeing in the market for businesses like yours, either your sector, the size and scale that you're at. Is it a good time to sell? There's sometimes where it's not a great time to sell. They're just interest rates are high. It was terrible during the recession back in the kind of 0809 period. Folks that procrastinated leading up to, sort of the end of 0708, they really had a long time, a long slog before they could actually go to market, because most often when buyers are looking at your business, they're looking at a certain trailing financial performance. And if you've been through the recession, you want to get rid of that. I mean, much the way we tried to get rid of COVID to some extent. You don't really want to show a lot about what was going on then necessarily. So a lot of procrastination. Sometimes folks are a little distrustful of professional advisors. But I always say, listen, we're very confidential. I mean, obviously, as attorneys, we're very confidential. But everybody that I deal with in M&A generally is confidential, very respectful, willing to be flexible typically. So, find out a little bit more about the process early on to demystify it, and then figure out what works best for you and who are those people outside of your own organization that you can look to for help. Because at least in my experience, the thing that's really tough for an owner is they feel that they're going it alone because they don't want to tell anybody else in the organization what they're thinking.
Well, thank you. And so you mentioned advisors and Nate mentioned a team. Nate does valuation, both for tax and financial reporting and also for litigation. Natasha does valuation for a variety of purposes, especially litigation. Susie, you're an experienced lawyer. You handle a lot of mergers and acquisitions and transactions. And Andrew handles complex damage models, financial loss litigation, planning and funding. So we have a variety of expertise on the line. I do a lot of valuation, especially for litigation. What does a team of advisors look like, or is it really depends on the needs of the situation and the timing?
Well, I mean, I do think it depends on your needs, but you're going to need a lawyer, obviously, if you're really going to be serious about getting into the M&A process. Sometimes your lawyer is a great lawyer, but not necessarily experienced in M&A. We see that a lot where, maybe that person's involved in the process, but they reach out to someone who's got more experience. Your accountant is, absolutely terrific. There's tax planning behind every M&A deal. 100% of M&A deals are driven by the tax consequences in the structure. So you really need those resources. But I also really feel that an investment banker, you might call it a broker, I mean, whoever, whatever fits your market segment and size, I just think they can add a lot of value. And I really encourage people to talk to folks like that and make sure they've got that team in place.
Thank you. Natasha, at the outset, I said one of the things we'll talk about is the difference between price and value. So the price in a transaction, or the asking price, or an inquiry, maybe even with a letter of interest and a price mentioned, is that the same as value?
No, there can definitely be differences between price and value. And just taking as an example, one of the more common standards of value, which is fair market value, that a lot of times valuations are done under a fair market value standard of value. And, even in my engagement letters, I say the results of this fair market values engagement are not a guarantee of the actual price for which this business or asset will be sold. And for a little bit of context here, fair market value is largely seen as a hypothetical standard of value. The definition of it is a hypothetical willing buyer and a hypothetical willing seller, with neither being under any compulsion to buy or sell, and both having reasonable knowledge of all relevant facts. And that, in essence, provides a definition of a hypothetical world of fair market value. In contrast, there's a lot of nuance when you're actually negotiating a transaction, and the actual sell price in a transaction can be influenced by, for example, the strategic motivations of the buyer or the seller, any synergies that are expected from the acquisition, macroeconomic conditions, market conditions, regulatory considerations, and as we've touched on a little bit, negotiation dynamics can affect the sale price, affect that transaction price. And I could think of a few other little examples that I want to provide briefly. For example, a buyer will be willing to pay a premium above fair market value if they believe that acquisition is going to provide some sort of strategic advantage. For example, access to new markets, access to technologies, or the acquisition of complementary products and services. Along that same line of thinking, a buyer might be willing to pay more if they anticipate savings or revenue enhancements or other forms of synergies. And in contrast to that, a seller, if they have an urgent need to exit the market, and this goes back to something that was said earlier by Nate, is get involved in your exit strategy early. If they have some sort of financial distress, or for personal reasons they want to exit their business quickly, it could cause them to accept a price below fair market value. So yeah, there can always be differences.
Well, thank you. And Andrew, Natasha sort of said a lead in with this. We're getting into the motivations of particular buyers and sellers. Does that make a difference?
It does. I think Natasha got it completely correct with the fair market value concept being hypothetical, and this is what's supposed to happen under all reasonable assumptions. And then you have the motivation factor, which is how irrational are both parties going to be in the face of reasonable and verifiable information? And that's the motivation factor, because you can have a perfect deal that works for everyone. It benefits everyone under every possible metric. There's no loser. But one person, it's their family company, and they're not willing to let anyone else see it. It takes every ounce of reasonable information that you have and throws it out the window. And knowing this in the very beginning, before you begin an engagement, can help you or help both parties save a lot of headache. Because if in the very beginning, you know that that party is not going to sell the business no matter what the number is, it's not worth anyone's time to put a number on it. That's the X factor. That's the time that you have to know, walk away, or explain to them that there is an objective concept. This is where we're all going to end up. And if your motivations will not allow you to act logically in the face of this information, you might not be the party to do it. And that's in everyone's best interest. It doesn't help them to go down a path of heartbreak if it's never going to close. It's not worth the lawyers spinning their wheels. No investment bankers need to be involved when they get to the end and find out their commission is blown because the transaction would never occur. And knowing this up front makes it a lot easier and avoids all kinds of forced closures, going to court and demanding injunctive relief to make sure a closing occurs. It causes additional litigation when people are irrational. It's better to know up front.
So Andrew, Natasha was talking first about fair market value in a hypothetical market. Both parties reasonably informed, neither with any undue motivations, not having any strategic or synergistic contemplations in mind. You're saying there's another element. Everything that Natasha was saying, there's distinctions depending on which of those assumptions apply, but those sound like rational economic elements that may be added or removed, or may be inputs in certain situations and not in others. But you're saying there's another element that's not necessarily rational, maybe emotional, or maybe completely irrational.
Correct. And that other piece, it needs to be known, but can only be known through actual discussion. You're not going to find that in the documents. You're not going to find that in the transaction papers. That's why you have to know your client, and you have to be willing to have an honest and open conversation about what they're doing, because Natasha and Nate and Susie have gone over how this should be done when everyone does what they are supposed to do under the right assumptions. But you need to know in the very beginning that the party understands that, or all of the other assumptions are gone.
Like, if Natasha, I could back up to you for a moment. When we see reports or publications that say that businesses, this industry sold for X dollars, or it's a database that says over the last so many months there have been transactions and these are the multiples. Are you able to tell by just looking at those statistics as to whether there were any motivations that may be unique in those situations? In other words, are those prices necessarily representative of fair market value, or would you need more information?
Oh, well, so for example, if you're referring to like a publicly M&A activity in the public market, or if you're referring to M&A activity in the private market, of course, getting data on transactions, even though there are databases that we have access to regularly, they're not filled with robust information. So I think what you're asking here is, are there synergies embedded in those pricing multiples, or do they represent fair market value? And I think the answer is we would have to go to the financial statements of the target and the acquirer to sort of parse that out and determine whether or not an adjustment would need to be made there. And I don't know if Nate wants to add his thoughts on this. My initial thought is that there could be something, it could have been for a price other than fair market value easily.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that like we look at transaction data and that's the market and like what could be truer than a market price, right? But you don't know those motivations necessarily, and it can be, depending on the amount of information you have about the background of the transaction, very difficult. And if you are doing an analysis based on those, it's sort of incumbent on the analyst to try and sort out to the extent they can what's in there and kind of get some kind of apples to apples comparison. But yeah, it's definitely very difficult to assess afterwards, even what went into it.
I'll add that it's easier when you're using a guideline public company methodology, because then you have at least have the audited financial statements of the acquirer. And there may be a robust disclosures regarding the target. And that may help you parse that out.
Well, thank you. Susie, we talked a little bit about, Andrew had mentioned, maybe it's a family business or something else where maybe there are some unique motivations, or maybe some decisions that are being made that aren't completely based upon maybe not what everyone would say are rational economics. Maybe there's some reasonable disagreement as to those views. What is your experience with family businesses? Are there quite often different dynamics?
John, all the time. All the time. I've represented a lot of family-owned businesses, and they're not all the same. But I would say in general, just one of my observations is a lot of times the family members don't want to talk about money with each other. They're, guarded, don't want to talk about difficult topics. Things can be a lot more emotional. And so, I always encourage people, get the group together, don't necessarily, if you've got multiple stakeholders in a family business, you don't have to make people feel that they're on the outside, but be great on your communication. Recognize up front that it's an emotional time, that this may be the passing of, an era for the family. And in the old days, what I call the old days now, which is sort of not really something anyone says anymore, a lot of businesses just got passed down within the family and they really didn't get sold. But we don't see that very much anymore. Usually whether it's the founder or at least that generation of the family that's really taken hold and is running the business, they see an opportunity for sale. And this is really the opportunity to basically be able to monetize your investment. Even if you monetize it for the benefit of, many future generations, you're going to take that legacy and perhaps hand it down a different way. But it can definitely be complicated. And I think that the advisors that are involved need to be very sensitive to that and very open and accepting and not judgmental, because it's normal. It's just a normal part of the process. And I don't think you need to make it more difficult by telling people to sort of, shape up and act like they're strangers or just financial partners and they're not going to see each other after the deal closes.
There are many very successful family businesses. In fact, there are some family businesses that are very, very large. There are some public companies that the original family still are very large shareholders and to some extent have a significant influence on the public company. So the situations with family is what you're getting to mostly that if whether they're family or not, if they don't have to answer to public stockholders or outside investors, they really only have to answer to themselves or primarily to themselves. And then if there's a relatively small group of them and their individual needs and interests change, maybe that just adds more to the dynamic. Are those and then also maybe this is a first time experience trying to sell a business or buy a business. They're not regular professional buyers or sellers. Are those the the elements here? Because family businesses are a very large part of our economy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, but no, I agree with what, your comments, John. I would say this, most family businesses or closely held businesses, they're not responding to the needs of anybody other than the main, the ownership group, a small, closely controlled group of individuals or related entities. It's completely different than the public company dynamic. But it's what most of our businesses are. If you look at the M&A activity, I would think the vast number of M&A transaction is in closely held, including family businesses. Especially now, given the demographics of the baby boomers.
Thank you. Andrew, would you like to add anything?
I think that Susie's right. The motivations get a little funky when it's a family, and because you don't have to do external reporting, it's occasionally easier for a lawyer to specifically represent the best interest of the ongoing entity to the family as a beginning step, and to say this is the objective of what everyone should do in the best interest of the company and everyone's wealth. This is how it would end the best if they represent the company, not the individuals, and say, now knowing that this is the best for the company, you all get to talk amongst yourselves with your own individual lawyers as you feel necessary to make this happen. But if you all fight with each other, this plan doesn't happen. And that's the hardest thing to get people to understand. It's like herding cats, and it's the part of the market that usually isn't brought out. All of the individual interests don't realize that there is an overwhelming best outcome. It's prisoner's dilemma on a grand scale, but nobody's there to point them in the right direction and tell them that this isn't the prisoner's dilemma. You can ask them a question and they're not going to say, he did it. Now that you all know it's in everyone's best interest and that's how we're going to act, go get your own counsel to get it papered. But that's priority one. Get all of you on the same page so then your irrational behavior can take hold afterwards when you know the best outcome. At that point, we've done our job. We've given you all the tools to succeed. If you choose to mess it up, that's on you.
So it sounds a little bit like the Kevin Costner John Dutton character from the Yellowstone TV series, where he's decided that the family's always going to have this ranch and it's all about the cattle ranch. And that's what's important, regardless of whether I have opportunities to sell this and make a lot more money, versus kind of the Kevin O'Leary approach on Shark Tank, where it's all focused on, tell me about cash flow, and you have really a protectable business, and how am I going to get my money back? That you have this dynamic that can be far different, sometimes competing views, and you need to balance that out if you're looking to try to maximize value in a transaction if you're a family business. Okay, well, thank you. We heard a little bit before from Natasha about synergy. So Nate, just give us a little more specifics. What are synergies? And will a buyer actually pay for the synergies?
Mm. Yeah, synergies, I mean, that's where the magic happens, right? That's sort of one of the driving forces for M&A activity, or for consolidation within an industry. Most companies, or as companies are growing, or if they're have an equity sponsor, they're going to have a growth mandate and they're going to be looking to acquire. I would almost say that the synergies might be a rationalization in some cases for the growth, but it's going to come in either side, either the revenue side or the cost side. It's either going to give you enhance your cash flows by driving additional revenues, or it's going to cut costs and give you some savings. I mean, I think the classic idea of you see an announcement for a merger, and I would give one, but I don't want to date this for the viewers later, where you see the headline about how many thousand people are going to get laid off, right? Because they're now redundant, and so there's this cost cutting element to it. There's also, the ability to reduce costs by maybe you have scale in purchasing and you're able to get better terms for your purchasing. There's geographical considerations if you're entering a new geography, or if you're now able to kind of use the distribution centers more strategically and kind of reduce some of your overhead costs that way. And the revenue side, some examples are sort of cross-selling your product alongside the sellers as a buyer, cross-selling your product alongside the sellers, or vice versa. Depending if there are different platforms or different markets that you're pushing these through. Now, as to whether a buyer is going to pay for that, I think I smiled earlier when Natasha was saying that these are the things that will entice a buyer to pay more for a business. But I think the conventional wisdom, right, is that a buyer's not going to pay for something they bring to the table. And so there's that sort of side of it. You could consider that kind of a negotiating or opening position, maybe. Because the truth is that there's not just one buyer for any business. There's other market participants, and some synergies can be captured by any of the market participants. And so somebody's going to have to pay more than the other guy. They're going to have to pay for some of that. You're going to have to share some of that benefit with the seller. There's certainly examples where the synergy is more specific to the buyer, and they're going to definitely probably not pay for that to the extent that they're able to. So it really sort of depends. And if you've spoken to a valuation person ever, you will have heard the answer, it depends, to a question. That's the answer to every question. So I'll leave it there. It depends, John.
Well, Nate, we're talking about synergies and whether a buyer would pay for them. And you said there may be some that are unique to certain buyers or situations. Could income tax benefits be one of those? Could there be some benefit that a buyer could realize that the seller can't?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. I don't know that falls in the category of not being available to multiple potential buyers, but there certainly are. If you have a company that's got some NOLs, and as Susie mentioned earlier, the structuring and is there to capture the tax benefits, and that is going to be absolutely essential to how the deal is put together. And there can be ways for, I think Andrew might have referred earlier to, both parties kind of enjoying some a win-win situation, which is a happy thing to see. So yeah, definitely there are some areas like that.
Thank you. And Natasha, you'd mentioned standards of value, and that standards of value can make a difference. How do you know which standard of value to use?
Well, different standards of value will be appropriate given different valuation purposes or different regulatory environments governing that valuation. So to back up a little bit, a standard of value is the framework in which a valuation is conducted. And it provides the guiding principles or criteria that you use to develop the opinion of value. And the most common ones are the one we've already mentioned, fair market value, but there's also intrinsic value, investment value, liquidation value, fair value, which is different and distinct in a lot of ways from fair market value. And the standard of value makes a difference because different standards of value often do result in different valuation outcomes. Now, for example, in a transaction where a business is being sold to a non-strategic buyer, the fair market value standard of value may be the most relevant standard because it represents that hypothetical world where there's a willing buyer and a willing seller, and there's under compulsion. Both would accept the transaction at, under an arm's length deal. And so in that case, you could use fair market value and it would be appropriate. And also along with that, the IRS requires the use of fair market value for gift and estate tax valuation compliance purposes. Compare that to a shareholder dispute or litigation, and the appropriate standard of value is commonly fair value. And I say commonly because it varies by state. In Illinois, for example, fair value is defined in a pretty specific way by the case law as the most fair and equitable treatment of the property owner. And the objective of that in that context, the objective of the valuation in that context is not to estimate the activity of a hypothetical marketplace, but rather it's to restore the property owner to his or her former economic status. And it's also important to note that in Illinois, that fair value standard doesn't include consideration for discounts for lack of control and or unless there's some really interesting things going on, it doesn't provide for discount for lack of marketability. And so you would have to really evaluate what is the purpose, what is the context for this valuation, and what is pertinent in each particular case scenario. And I would say that analysts have to exercise a lot of caution here because the standard of value for state proceedings varies by state. And the same is true not just in shareholder litigation, but also in marital dissolution proceedings where that standard of value can vary by state. One more example, in a bankruptcy proceeding, liquidation value may be the primary valuation consideration, because perhaps the most important thing is to know what amount would the creditors expect to receive from the sale of the company's assets in either an orderly or a forced liquidation. And so it really depends on the situation and the scenario, and it's really crucial that each analyst understands that different valuation purposes and scenarios require different standards of value, and different ones can be appropriate under different circumstances.
Okay, so you shared some insight about standards of value. When we're talking about value, well, let's assume hypothetically we have a corporation, a closely held corporation, a C corporation, a very common situation. What are we talking about in value? Because corporations have assets, they have liability, they have equity in the form of outstanding stock. They also have debt. So what are we talking about? If a company has a lot of debt and company A has a lot of debt, company B has a lot of debt, do they both have the same value, or does it depend on how we're measuring it?
Yeah, well, they might both have the same enterprise value, but the bifurcation, the mix of that value between equity and debt holders might be different, right? So it could be that, on a whole, they're sort of worth the same. And really what we need to do is just kind of go over some terminology here, which is invested capital. And invested capital refers to the total amount of capital that has been contributed to a company by both equity investors, such as shareholders, and debt investors, such as bondholders or other lenders. And it includes that equity capital, which represents the ownership interest in the company, and debt capital, which represents funds that are borrowed and that the company must repay. And so that amount of invested cap, that mix will determine, what portion of the value, the enterprise value, pertains to the shareholders' equity, what portion pertains to the debt holders. Typically, when you arrive at enterprise value, and I should probably define that too, enterprise value is the total value of the company's operating assets, regardless of who owns those assets. Those assets could be funded with either debt or equity. So it's the value of all the company's assets, no matter how it's funded. And when you calculate enterprise value, typically you subtract out debt to get to equity value in a very simplified manner here, right? I'm not getting into all the nuances of the calculations. But the enterprise value is the holistic view of the company's value from the perspective of all the stakeholders, both equity and debt investors. Does that answer your question, John?
Yes, yes, it does. So if for example, Natasha, if I were to go look at publicly traded company data, like if I look at New York Stock Exchange stocks, and I was looking at market capitalization size, in other words, based upon the number of shares of stock multiplied by the price per share and take that product. Is it possible some of the companies that might look relatively small in market capitalization might really be, by some other measure, say revenues or total assets, gigantic companies because they had a very large amount of debt outstanding compared to the amount of stock they own?
Yes, absolutely. And that information is, in addition to the market cap, which in addition to any of the equity component, the information pertaining to the outstanding debt of the company is also easily and readily available. And so you could get in an instant for almost nearly any publicly traded company information on their the sum of their enterprise value, what they have outstanding in debt plus their market cap, which is referred to as their total invested capital.
Well, thank you. Andrew, we talked about a few terms here with Natasha. What about metrics? Like we hear, well, there's multiples applied to something, or they did some kind of present value of something going forward. What kind of metrics are there? We hear terms like EBITDA and free cash flow. Are there some common metrics that prospective buyers and sellers quite often use?
Yes, there absolutely are. So EBITDA is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. Essentially, take your first page of your tax return, net income on the bottom line, add back what you paid in depreciation and amortization, your non-cash expenses that you got to deduct, and then add back your taxes and your interest expenses, which is managerial accounting, as they shouldn't be considered ongoing expenses. And that's usually a very basic measure of value. You then get a multiple depending on industry if you go to sell it on your EBITDA number. So the thing that you need to know in the beginning is what to compare it against, because like all numbers, it can be very high and very low and mean absolutely nothing. You could have had one great year, one horrific year. The most important thing to use this data with is a baseline and a set of metrics and guidelines that you can analyze it against. Having great data is one thing, but if you have nothing to know what to compare it against, it's worthless. In this situation, you need to know what their competitors are doing in terms of EBITDA. You need to know if they're looking to sell, what recent transactions have closed at a multiple of their current EBITDA, and you need to see if it's historically going up or down. There are other measures of value, but it depends on what type of industry that you're doing it for. Specifically, EBITDAs for classic industries that are marketing service driven, have actual assets, have revenue correlated to activity. These are not things for weird asset classes. So when you're looking to sell a standard business, well, a standard business that has actual revenue, actual operations, a marketing capacity, this is a very good baseline to start at. This is also why, like Susie and Nate said, you need a team, because this first number gets you the first step of who you speak to next. Are you looking to sell this out in a public marketplace? Are we looking for a private sale? If you had the best year ever, this might be the metric you want. If you had a horrible year, there are 15 other accepted metrics that, along with the appropriate disclosures, could be a better measure of your organization's value. It depends more on the industry and the business to determine what type of metrics you should use.
Thank you. And Natasha, there are also some terms we hear like pro forma or normalization adjustments. How do those come into play relative to what Andrew was talking about as potential valuation metrics like EBITDA or free cash flow and the like?
Sure. So I'll start off by saying that in nearly every valuation of a privately held, closely held company that I value, normalization adjustments, we call them normalization valuation adjustments, they're almost always required. And those adjustments are made to present a more accurate picture of a company's financial performance by removing the effects of, for example, one-time transactions or other sorts of non-recurring items, as well as adjusting for any transactions or financial items that distort the picture of the company's earnings. And common normalization adjustments include one that I've just mentioned, which is non-recurring items. And it can include any adjustment to exclude one-time or non-recurring expenses or one-time or non-recurring non-repeatable revenues, anything that's not expected to occur regularly in the future. For example, restructuring costs, costs paid for legal settlements, gains and losses from the sale of assets, any of those things that are sort of unusual. We also typically do normalization adjustments. So this you can, if you are the owner of a small or medium-sized privately held business, you don't have audited financial statements and or perhaps not the best operational structures, then you can expect that there's going to be some adjustments involving the add back or the deduction of certain expenses or revenues to reflect a more typical or sustainable level of performance. For example, if a company had unusually high or low expenses in a particular period due to seasonality or unusual fluctuations in commodity prices, or perhaps a change in accounting method, we would make an adjustment to normalize those financial figures to better reflect the company's ongoing operations. It's also very, very common to do an adjustment for owner's compensation. And that can include an adjustment where the owner was either under or overcompensated. And I've seen it both ways. It's not just the owner had an excessively high salary as compared to the market rate of compensation. I've also seen it the other way where the owner was underpaying himself and, in presenting the company at a fair market value standard of value, one could reasonably expect that an owner operator who was performing a legitimate function at the company would be expected to be paid at a market rate of salary. We also very, very typically adjust for discretionary expenses. These are non-business related expenses that are run through the company. And that could include anything you can possibly imagine that's not business related. We make an adjustment for that. Sometimes in the case of mergers or acquisitions, we may make an adjustment if it's not a fair market value standard of value to reflect anticipated synergies or anticipated cost savings that might result from the transaction. Sometimes we're engaged to just do sort of hypothetical scenario analyses. And in that case, we will consider those synergies and cost savings and other sorts of strategic advantages from an M&A transaction.
So is the premise for making these adjustments in part that there would be an independent, economic, rational, controlling third party owner? So for example, if you had the San Francisco 49ers quarterback Brock Purdy making $850,000 a year, and if you knew it was the last year of his contract, and that the going rate next year in theory would be $25 million a year instead of $850,000 a year, would that be a candidate for an economic normalization adjustment?
Oh yeah, I mean, that sports ball is not my arena, but yeah, in theory it would be. So really what, here's an example from a real client, whose name I won't disclose, but the client is anticipating exiting their business. They're going to sell their ownership interests to another longtime manager of the company. And the goal is that they're going to hire somebody to replace the manager when the majority owner exits, because the manager will move up into the new role and somebody will need to be replaced. So when we did our modeling, we modeled the replacement salary for the person they were going to have to hire. That's a very simplified example, right? But it can get really complicated when you're doing projections, and maybe we'll have time to talk about that. But considering what the future needs of the company are going to be in order for that company to sustain its operations.
Well, thank you. We have about 10 minutes remaining. I'll jump ahead a little bit. We talked about some terms, Nate. What's internal rate of return? We briefly mentioned DCF. Is that like a cost of capital, or is that something different? And what is a DCF?
Yeah, it is a measure of a return or a cost of capital in a way. The internal rate of return, or the IRR, we try to use acronyms for everything so that we don't trip over our words, I think. At least I do. That's what happens actually. So if you have a transaction and you're looking at a deal model or a DCF with a set of projections and and a purchase price, the IRR is what happens when you play your DCF backwards effectively. I mean, you have those three pieces that all have to line up. And so if you know the price and you know the cash flows, you can measure the IRR. Conversely, if you're trying to put a value on the business, what you would normally be doing is taking a market-based measure of return, the weighted average cost of capital, say, and applying that to the cash flow streams to see what the indicated value is. So the IRR can be is useful as a comparison tool. A buyer might have a threshold IRR or hurdle rate that they're trying to earn more than, and that they need to have it pencil out, or they're underwriting their deal at a certain rate of return. You can also compare that rate of return to a market-based indication like WACC to determine if it looks like they underpaid or overpaid. And in retrospect, and kind of thinking about some of the financial reporting that happens afterwards in terms of purchase price allocation and the like. So yeah, it's the IRR is that discount rate that kind of matches up the cash flows and the purchase price.
Susie, is there sometimes contingent consideration? In other words, is the acquisition sometimes not all based upon a fixed price?
John, happens all the time, especially when there's a disconnect between the buyer and the seller's expectations. Sometimes that contingent consideration, or we often call it an earnout, is a way to bridge the gap between what a seller wants for the sale in terms of overall purchase price and what a buyer wants to pay. And so if you think about it just in simple terms, an earnout or / contingent consideration is generally an ability to receive additional payments, which represent additional purchase price after the closing, based upon some metric, typically some metric of performance after the closing. It might be, if earnings exceed what you're projecting over the next 12 to 24 months, you'll get a little, added extra bonus on the purchase price. Sometimes it's the seller trying to sell what the future holds, and the buyer saying, basically, prove it. And if it happens and the business proves it, then yeah, you as a seller are going to get paid. The only thing that's tricky, obviously, is that often the seller is not involved in decisions and operating the business post-closing. So it can be a tricky negotiation, but we've been seeing it a lot, I would say, throughout 2023 and still even into 24 a little bit, although the M&A market has picked up, I would probably say since Labor Day of 23. But when things were kind of softening a little bit in the 23 market, we started seeing a lot of earnouts just to keep parties together and offer the promise of an added purchase price to the seller.
And I think that's a good segue over to Andrew, where she was talking about contingent consideration increasing in popularity, at least for a while because of the economics in the marketplace. So, Andrew, we understand you do a lot of work in the area of complex damage models and financial loss assessment, and a lot of that uh, arises when there are problems with transactions, post-closing claims. So from your perspective, Andrew, what types of post-closing claims seem to be the most troublesome, and what can be done to help avoid them?
So I think everyone's idea is to make sure that everything works out correctly, but I'm what happens when they don't. So no matter how carefully you draft something and no matter how much everyone gets along at the time, there's always the possibility that something goes wrong. And it could be a large something like one of the parties violates an ongoing non-disclosure agreement or a non-circumvention, or they get a post-closing, you can't compete with us in this marketplace, and they do. And it's almost always because one party decided that the economic gain of their actions made it worth the litigation expense or the risk of it happening. So what we say is get the best transactional lawyers you can, build in every possible risk parameter you can, agree on all measures of damages, liquidated costs, liquidated damage provisions, set it up in the beginning where you're going to litigate, because when this goes wrong, it'll save you $50,000 if we decide that we're fighting in the Southern District of New York instead of the Middle District of Minnesota. Pick basic things and make sure that the provisions in your contract are what you want them to be. It'll save you a ton of money post-closing if you know that there's no jury, if you know that you've waived a judge and you're looking at arbitration. It's better to know the remedies and the recourse up front and know what's available. It will save you time on the back end. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That's the old expression. It's a lot easier to not have something go wrong if both parties realize the extent of the recourse available if something does. If you're not dealing with minor issues and both parties realize that if you do something to violate your terms post-closing in bad faith, the recourse available to the non-breaching party is so great that you don't want to do it. That's our best advice. Make it so unbelievably punitive for one of the parties to breach post-closing that they know not to do it. And sadly, that's what we see the most of. That's when I say I see the worst of the worst. I see one party took something and we're going to end up in court. It's just what are the options of recourse available to us and how quickly can I go through them? That's pretty much our post-closing concern.
Well, in general, it seems that behavior between parties, generally, if there is a dispute, could fall into a few categories. Maybe reasonable minds disagree. That could be one category. Maybe another category is somebody just made a mistake. And then the third category is occasionally somebody really is up to no good. So is there something else that can be done? In other words, if they have all the planning and advisory expertise that's on the panel here, for example, can they buy insurance? Is there something else they can do?
You have post-closing insurance, you have D&O insurance. We have in our documents what we call kill shot provisions, where they basically make it so where I don't have to go to court to get an injunction. I have a confession of judgment. I have grounds for we've agreed that the standard for injunctive relief isn't irreparable harm. I have a specific copy of a confession of judgment so I can go handle it afterwards. These are the pre-closing concerns that are rather complex, but keep you as the non-breaching party protected against a breach.
Now, are you working for buyers or sellers?
I'm a neutral. I am 100% agnostic. We
So,
don't we don't have a side. We'll take either side of the transaction post whatever goes wrong and look at it post-mortem. It's not either side. Usually it seems like the buyers are the ones that breach. That's what we see more often than the sellers, but that's because they have greater upside.
okay, well, we are very near the end of our time. Andrew or Nate or Natasha, is there anything you would like to add here in the last minute or so?
I wish we had time to talk about more things, especially, dive into more valuation theory and how projections play a role and how the future prospects of a company are really the hugest driver of value. So I look forward to our next conversation when we get to dive into that more.
Well, thank you, Nate.
Yeah, I'm with Natasha. I think that's a great leave off point that, valuation is always sort of future looking, always
Yeah.
future oriented. So the past is the past. The past is prologue.
Andrew?
I swear it's a lot easier than I make it out to be because you have great professionals on this that handle all of those issues that I talk about. And it's why you have these great people on this webinar who are kind enough to tell you everything to do so you never have to hear about the downside risk on my side. That's why you use them.
Thank you. We want to thank our viewers and listeners, and on behalf of not only Financial Poised, but also on behalf of Natasha Escobedo, Nate Ladwig, Susie Saxman, Andrew Schneider, and myself, John Levitsky. We're glad that you have been here and tuned into our program, and we would look forward to seeing you on future Financial Poised programs. Thank you, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Our contact information is in the back of the deck. Have a good day and take care. Bye-bye.